What if you never really owned your tech again? No more buying consoles, phones, or even cars outright, just endless monthly payments. That sounds a bit extreme, right? But with tariffs targeting manufacturing, companies might no longer have a choice. Because here's the thing, tariffs don't target services. And in a world where the tariffs are getting as high as 145%, what if the solution for companies isn't bringing back manufacturing to America, but rather turning everything into a service instead? Because if what you pay for is a service and not a product, there may be a future in which tariffs can be circumvented altogether. But at what cost?
New today, consumer sentiment plummeting to one of the lowest levels on
plummeted 10%, and the company lost more than $50 billion in market
United States
took office, targeted
trade war between the U.S. and China. China wins.
This whole thought came to my mind on Liberation Day, the day that President Trump announced his tariffs to the world, which just so happened to be the same day that Nintendo announced the Switch 2. Now, the Nintendo Switch 2 paints a fascinating picture for three primary reasons. Firstly, it's a new piece of technology and it's the latest console to be released. Secondly, Nintendo is really primarily a software company, not a hardware company. And thirdly, despite all of the technology in one of these things, it's not considered technology as far as the US tariffs are concerned. It's considered a toy. And this is important because technology, as of now, is tariff exempt, but toys, that's a full tariff. Since the announcement of the Nintendo Switch 2, pre-orders were launched, then rolled back, and then released again in order to see how the whole tariff situation unfolded. Now, set to officially launch on June 5th, 2025, it was priced at $450 in the US. Now, analysts estimate that the bill of materials, what Nintendo actually paid to manufacture the product, cost around $400. This suggests that prior to the tariffs, Nintendo had a profit margin of approximately $50 per unit. However, with the introduction of new tariffs, 24% on Japanese imports, 46% on Vietnamese imports, and currently 145% on Chinese imports, the cost to bring in consoles, games, and accessories has increased substantially. Now, despite these added costs, Nintendo has maintained the US retail price of the Switch 2 at $450. Accessories, however, saw some price increases, but as far as the Switch 2 is concerned, Nintendo seems to be selling it at cost in the US market. Now, this scenario underscores a broader challenge in the tech industry. Hardware is subject to tariffs, while the software and services, which often represent a significant portion of the product's value, are not. Companies like Nintendo rely on the sale of games and online services to generate profit, especially when hardware is sold at or below cost. Because let's be real, when you buy a video game, what are you actually paying for? The value of the game is in the software, the code, the graphics, the story, everything that makes the game worth playing. But here's where it gets weird. If you buy a physical copy, that little plastic cartridge or disc, even though it costs pennies to make, it gets hit by tariffs. Not just the plastic though, the entire import, because tariffs don't care about the value of what's on the outside. It's the inside that counts. No, I'm just kidding. It's the cost of the entire physical product crossing the border.
The product starts somewhere. Again, for clothing, well, you start with the cotton or whatever the material is, it gets shipped to another country, gets put into, gets further fabricated, et cetera. It's only the final price of the product as it enters the US that's going to be subject to the tariff. But the US can play different games. The question then becomes, well, is it the price free on board in the exporting country, or is it the delivered price at the US? The delivered price includes shipping costs, insurance costs, maybe finance costs. So the delivered price is going to be higher than the free on board price in the exporting country, and hence, the overall tariff will be larger.
Let's start by navigating the big picture journey of a product. It starts off with manufacturing, followed by distribution, followed by wholesale, and then finally retail, where the general public will show up to buy. So if tariffs are up by whatever percentage they happen to be up by today when you're watching this video, let's say 145% for China, that doesn't mean that the price you pay at retail will be 145% higher. It means the price that the distributor purchases it at import will increase by 145%. But there's ways to get around this, of course. For example, the primary importer of Nintendo Switches is Nintendo of America, and most of the Switches that they have imported to the United States were manufactured in Vietnam. But according to Bloomberg, roughly a third of Switch 2 consoles are assembled in Vietnam. Now that's an important word, assembled, because most of the components inside the Switch 2 likely came from a variety of countries before that, including Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and, you guessed it, China.
If you look at Trump and his team's objective to sort of reindustrialize the US, the primary targets are going to be manufacturing or anything tangentially related to manufacturing. And not all manufacturing. I mean, does he care about repatriating the clothing industry? Not really. But sort of the heavy manufacturing and those sectors that A, provided good jobs in the Midwest, and B, are necessary strategically for the military. So steel industry, aluminum industry, obviously technology, manufacturing of machinery, equipment, vehicles, tanks, ships, etc.
Who's going to get hit the hardest with these tariffs, the developers or the retailers in the United States?
It depends on what Nintendo wants to do. So, for example, if they're going to sell the hardware, if the Japanese yen has declined in value against the US dollar, Nintendo could reduce the US dollar price to minimize the impact of the tariff and still maintain their yen revenues. So part of it will depend upon what's happening to the exchange rate between the yen and the US dollar. So that's one possibility. A second is they reduce the US dollar price to match what happens to the yen US dollar exchange rate. And then it's the retailer either passes on sort of that lower price plus the tariff and doesn't take a hit, but the retailer will then take a hit and lower demand, or Nintendo may tell the retailer, you're also going to have to take a hit on your margin. I suspect like all the game companies, they don't make their money on the hardware, they're making their money on the software, on the games. It's the old sort of razor and blade model. You give away the razor because you make your money on blades. So, Nintendo might say, you know what, we'll take the full hit. They may, come up with some other type of pricing model for their games.
And most of these games are made in Japan. At least that's the final location prior to entering the United States. And that's what's written on the back of the boxes. Now, according to ThingLabs.io, physical games make up only about 5% of market share. But this is somewhat of an unrealistic figure because there's lots of games that only release digitally these days, and then there's DLCs, which is primarily just digital downloads. So if we're talking about market share as far as revenue is concerned, it's always going to be skewed in favor of digital games. But this whole thought process made me think of a very outside the box thinking, which is what if Nintendo just started a subscription service sort of similar to Xbox Game Pass, where they include the hardware for free?
You subscribe to Nintendo so you have access to can play the game for X number of hours or number of games or whatever, pay a monthly subscription fee. And what happens then is, Nintendo's got a US company, so you're subscribing to that US company, so you're avoiding the tariff. And the question then for Nintendo is, well, how do they sort of repatriate the income without facing withholding taxes? Well, they can always lend money, in quotation marks, to their U.S. subsidiary, charge them significant interest to essentially wipe out their profits in the U.S., and essentially repatriate the profits and the money back to Japan or whatever other country they want to. With games or other services where you can have streaming services and make them available online, there are a number of interesting ways to get around the tariff, because you're avoiding putting something in a package that gets shipped to the US and hence is going to be faced with that tariff. And Nintendo and other companies are in this sphere, this space, they've got access to really good trade lawyers, and they'll figure out ways around the tariff for their particular services and products.
Why is it that these tariffs are only going after manufacturing and not services or software?
It's historical. You go back, way back when the UK was sort of the industrial powerhouse, what were the only services at the time? Financial or banking services, maybe transportation insurance services. There was no software, there were no streaming services. So the UK didn't want tariffs on services because that would only impact them or wouldn't impact anyone else. Services tended to be more local. They weren't really traded other than transportation services and some trade-related financial services. So they were always an afterthought. If it's available online, well, it's not brought into a country at some port of entry where some customs agent can say, aha, I see this, it's in this category, here's the tariff that has to be paid on it. So if it comes in a package, it's treated like a manufacturing product, it's going to be subject to a tariff, it's available online, it's not yet subject to tariff in most countries, and you got a lot of US tech companies, especially in the social media space, they don't want tariffs on anything online because that's going to have a negative impact on them.
And this is being reflected in the upcoming price of the Nintendo Switch 2 games, as the physical copies will be $10 more expensive than the digital ones. We've gotten so used to subscriptions, and in the short term, they feel like a win. I mean, take Photoshop, for example. It used to cost $700 up front. For a starting photographer, that's a prohibitive cost. But now it's just $29 a month. Someone who's starting out can easily grab a 1-month license and learn the craft. Apple, for example, has a service called the iPhone Upgrade Program, a monthly subscription for a piece of hardware. But of course, it's not about the hardware, it's the service that Apple provides. It's the Apple experience, it's the Apple ecosystem, Apple Music, Apple TV, etc. And the same is true with Peloton. They have a monthly subscription that includes the bike rental, and even Porsche has a subscription service, which includes the vehicle, insurance, roadside assistance, maintenance, and seasonal tire changes. So short term, it's much more accessible. But long term, we're all paying more.